Hey guys, how's it going? This is Daniel with Vantasia Media, and today we're going to talk about how you can edit your underwater photos in Lightroom. Let's go ahead and get started. This tutorial does assume some basic knowledge of Lightroom, how it works, what the different tools do. So as we're going through, we'll be using some specific tools. If you're not sure on those, I would recommend maybe starting with our Lightroom Basics course. You can find that in our workshops, or just writing those down and reminding yourself to revisit those after this video is done. Alright, so I've already copied all of my photos from my memory card onto my computer, got them organized on my computer here, and imported my photo I'll be working on into Lightroom. So we can go ahead and select it and hit develop. Now generally these sliders here, they're meant to be worked on from the top down. That's obviously a rule that is flexible, but in general, if you're not sure where to start, just go from the top and then work your way down on here. So one of the first things I always like to do when editing a photo, especially an underwater photo in Lightroom, is make sure the white balance is set. Cameras nowadays do a really good job of setting those, but it's still critical to make sure we do that in Lightroom. My favorite way to do that is to use the dropper tool. So what you do here is click the dropper tool right on the white balance section, and then find an area in your photo that you know is white. For example, on this picture, I have a really good option here on this fish. You can see these spots are looking pretty white, so I'm going to go ahead and select that as my dropper, and that immediately really brings out the colors in our photo and corrects them to be more true to what they actually are. A lot of light gets lost as we're going down, descending through the water, and that's why the colors change. We lose some of that vibrancy that we would have above land, so that's why it's super important to make sure we set our white balance correctly on our underwater photos. Okay, so now that I've got my white balance set, I'm just going to move on to my exposure settings. Did a pretty good job here on the dive. Everything looks good. The top could maybe use a little bit of light, so I'm going to go ahead and add a gradient filter and probably mask that so it's only affecting the reef up here. So I'll just add the exposure, bump that up a tiny bit, turn the range mask on, and we'll do that for luminance and just sample this section here so it's not really affecting the water, only the reef. I'll go ahead and work on that a little bit more. I really like to have the graduated filter on different parts of my image, especially in one where maybe the strobe lit up the front of the reef like this more than it lit up the back. That just gives me a little bit more control over local adjustments. It doesn't require me to make one change to the bottom that's also going to change the back or the top of the photo. I can really work on those almost as if they're like two separate sections of the photo. It just gives you a lot more control and a lot more customization over what you want to do. So I'll probably come back to that filter, but for now I'm just going to go adjust the contrast a little bit, bring down some highlights just so they're not so harsh. Maybe push up the shadows a tiny bit. Everything looks pretty good on this photo. I'm happy with the way it turned out. Definitely like to push up the texture, especially on underwater photos. Texture and clarity can just make it pop a little bit. Be careful not to overdo it because you can see we push it too much, it kind of just starts to look fake. So make sure that you are really conservative with those. Now as I'm editing, I'm keeping a close eye on my histogram up here. Everything here is pretty well distributed. I can see I've got a nicely exposed shot, not too many really big jagged bumps in my histogram. There's one here on the exposure. I'll probably bring that down a tiny bit, but overall it looks really good. Really important to keep an eye on that as you're editing your photos. Now I'll go ahead and I'll toy with the vibrance and saturation a little bit. Again, be really careful when you're using these. Be very conservative because these colors are already really vibrant, and if you push it up too much, again, it just gives the photo kind of a fake feeling. You want it to be true to what you were seeing when you were shooting the image, as close as possible to that, what you had in your mind when you were shooting the shot. Now we can check out the tone curve. This isn't a tool I use too much. I kind of prefer to use these these adjustments up here, but it can be really useful, especially if you want to just add some contrast to a photo really quickly. You can, or you can use this. You can see that they're labeled. So this is the highlights, our lights, our darks, and our shadows. So moving through here, I can see that the darks might need a little bit of work. So I'll do a quick adjustment there. And I can tell that by our graph is showing me that they're a little bit higher. There's just a little bit more. It doesn't necessarily always indicate that it's a bad thing. All right, so now I'll move down to the hue, saturation, and luminance section. Again, be careful when editing these. These can be really nice, especially with underwater photos. The blues tend to get blown out a little bit. So what you might want to do is push that down just a tiny bit. Especially, you can see this is 1/125th of a second. The slower our shutter speed, the more of that blue we're going to introduce. That's why we always recommend keep it right around or above faster than 1/125th a second. So again, don't overdo it. Be really conservative in making those changes. I'm not going to change too many things on the rest of these settings, if anything. This photo looks pretty good, but for example, like let's say I did want to bring the yellows up on this fish, or if you had a picture where maybe it was like a nudibranch that, you know, it was surrounded by sand and you really wanted to bring out the green or the blues or the colors of the nudie, you could use these specialized saturation, hue, luminance adjustments to focus on those specific colors in the photo. With a picture like this where it has lots of color everywhere, I prefer to do more local adjustments. Split toning is something I generally wouldn't recommend getting into unless you have a really specific use for it. Our colors are kind of distorted from the blues that come in. We've already done some changes to the white balance. I would normally leave this as is. Basically what it does is it just allows you to choose a color. So highlights, we're looking at highlights at like a green or yellowish color, and then I can push the saturation up on those specific colors to bring that out in the highlights. You can do the same in the shadows too. It makes a really big adjustment to the entire photo, which is why I kind of recommend not doing it. We're better off doing really specialized local adjustments for our saturation hues, things like that. Okay, so on to the detail section. I'm going to choose a portion of this photo that I know has a lot of detail so I can kind of focus on it and make sure I bring that out. I always add some sharpening to my photos, especially underwater. It's super important to be able to bring out the detail of these creatures and the scenery underwater. So don't overlook this tool. If you have questions or you want to get more in depth on these sliders, check out our online Lightroom workshop. We go in depth on all of this stuff. I always like to add a little bit of masking. It just makes it look not so, fake and clearly edited. Noise reduction, I'm not going to touch that for this photo. It can be kind of useful for backscatter, but since this is an adjustment to the whole photo, I will leave it at 0. My ISO is only 200, not a lot of noise coming up, so I'm going to leave that. Go ahead and enable remove chromatic aberration. So depending on the lens you're using, Lightroom may automatically recognize your profile, your lens profile, and enable that lens correction profile. If it does that, would definitely recommend leaving it on. That's already been built out for the lens to correct for distortion, vignetting, warping, things like that. For this picture in particular, I'm not going to do anything. I like the way it looks. There's not any warping. It was taken on a compact camera, so there's no vignetting. So I'm not going to change that, but keep in mind that Lightroom can automatically enable that, and you can also set up your own lens profile here. We've gone through most of our basic edits. These sections go over some additional effects and changes that we won't need for this photo and won't need for most photos. If you are interested in those, check out some of our Lightroom courses, or once again, write them down and come back to them after this video. All right, so I've done my first edits. I'm going to jump up to the top. I've got a few things I see in here that I really want to improve on. The biggest thing is over here. It looks pretty blue. That's where I think there was a sort of a slope here, and it's blocking any of the light from reaching this side of the photo. So I want to see if I can brighten that up, maybe change the white balance over there. So what I'm going to do for some local adjustments is I'm going to use the brush tool. So I'll click that, make sure I don't have any settings already in place. And then I'm just going to push the exposure up a little bit and the shadows. I'm going to be super careful, not make too many changes. Make sure that auto mask is on. What that's basically going to do is if I click here in the shadow, it's going to edit that shadow and not this section due to the color and luminance difference of that area of the photo. So I'm going to go ahead and just use that in some of these areas, brighten it up a little bit. I really would like to get that blue color out of there if possible. That's sort of my goal here. Whoops, I got that sponge in that. And if you need to, if you want to change the size, you can use the bracket keys to make it bigger and smaller. It can be really handy to edit and change things on the fly. And to undo an edit, you can either click Control-Z or Command-Z on a Mac, or Alt or Option, and you can remove it. You can see it changes to a minus. All right, so I pushed up the exposure and the shadows just a tiny bit. I think it looks pretty good. But next I'm going to see if I can get that blue color to be a little warmer. So I'm going to go to the white balance. Just increase that ever so slightly. Keeping an eye on my whole image and making sure I'm not making too big of a change at once. Cool, I think that looks a little bit better. This is definitely looking less blue and bringing out some of the colors over here, which is exactly what I was going for. I'll apply that over on this side as well. You can see I'm being really careful not to click outside of the reef, because then we'll start affecting this area, which we don't want to do. We want to deal with that on its own. So we've gone through our global adjustments using the sliders here on the right hand side. We added a few local adjustments with a gradient mask and an adjustment brush, so everything's looking pretty good. The next step is to remove backscatter, which we will cover in a different video. It's a subject that deserves its own video, and you're going to want to break from this and go grab a cup of coffee before you jump into that one. Now you should have a great idea of how you can use Lightroom to edit your underwater photos. If you have any other questions, check out my website at www.phantasiamedia.com or shoot me an email at dloud@phantasiamedia.com. Until next time.